In this video, we will be looking at the most important, most commonly used measure of variability, which is the standard deviation. Before we learn how to calculate the standard deviation, let's look at the variance. So, how do we find the variance? Suppose you have access to population data, right? Then the population variance, which is denoted by the Greek letter sigma square. This is sigma. So sigma square is equal to the summation of xi minus mu all square for I going from 1 to big N divided by big N, where remember that mu is the notation for the population mean, and then big N is a notation for the population size. Again, in almost all real-world applications, we don't have access to the population, so we often deal with samples. So suppose you have a sample. To calculate the sample variance, which is denoted by S square, you're going to use the following formula. So S square is equal to the summation of xi minus x bar all square for I going from 1 to small n divided by n minus 1, where x bar is the sample mean or sample average, and small n again is the sample size. So let's see what this formula tells us to do exactly. If you remember the second important result from the our discussion on summation notation, the numerator of this formula is going to be equal to x1 minus x bar all square plus x2 minus x bar all square plus x3 minus x bar all square plus all the way to x n minus x bar all square divided by n minus 1. Okay. So for example, suppose you have a data set with 5 observations. Okay, so suppose you have a sample with 5 observations. Then to calculate the sample variance, you're going to have x1 minus x bar all square plus x2 minus x bar all square plus x3 minus x bar all square plus x4 minus x bar all square plus x5 minus x bar all square divided by n minus 1 which is 5 minus 1. So now what do we need to know? We need to know x bar. X bar is just a sample mean, which you should be able to calculate. Right? So you first want to calculate the sample mean, then you calculate the difference between each of the observations and the sample mean all square. Add them all up, divided by n minus 1, which is 5 minus 1 in this case. We will look at an example in just a little bit. Okay. Now, turns out that there's another way for us to calculate the sample variance, which may or may not be easier. It depends on how you want to do it. But I'm just gonna give you the formula and you decide which formula you want to use. So it turns out that the sample variance, which is s squared, is also equal to the summation of xi squared for I going from 1 to small n minus n times the mean square divided by n minus 1. So if you look at this example again, suppose we have a sample with 5 observations. How do we apply this formula? We apply this formula as follows. So s squared is going to be equal to x1 squared plus x2 squared plus x3 squared plus x4 squared plus x5 squared minus n, which is equal to 5, times the mean square divided by n minus 1, which is 5 minus 1. We got this formula because if you expand the summation notation in the original formula, you're going to get x1 squared plus x2 squared plus all the way to xn squared minus n times x bar squared divided by n minus 1. So there are two ways to calculate the sample variance. We will look at an example in a little bit where I show you how to calculate the sample variance using both formulas, and then going forward you should pick the formula that you are more comfortable with. So now we said we want to know the standard deviation. Right? What's the relationship between the variance and the standard deviation? It turns out that the standard deviation and going forward, whenever I want to save time when I write, instead of writing standard deviation, I'm just going to write stdev. So whenever you see stdev, you should be thinking standard deviation. So what is a standard deviation? The standard deviation is just the positive square root of the variance. In other words, the sample standard deviation which is denoted by the letter S, is going to be equal to the square root of the sample variance, which is S squared. So in this video, we talked about the most commonly used, most important measure of variability in statistics, which is the standard deviation. In order to calculate the standard deviation, we need to find the variance first. Oftentimes, we don't have access to population data, so we deal with sample data. And there are two ways we can calculate the sample variance, which is denoted by S squared. Right? The first way to do it is to use this formula up here. The second way to do it is to use the second formula down here. Okay. Once you have the sample variance, in order to get the sample standard deviation, all you have to do is take the square root of the variance, and that gives you the standard deviation.